Hello, I'm Scott Manley Hadley. Today I'm reading My Father from a Distance, a prose chapbook I had published by SELCOUTH Station Press in 2019. This one is dedicated to Roger Moore. Don't know why. I think he was already dead by that point. Maybe he wasn't. When did Roger Moore die? I don't know. There's no one here. There's no audience. I don't know who I'm addressing that to. There are people here, but I've told them not to make any noises. My father is slowly dying of Parkinson's disease and has been for over 10 years. I have never been close to him, and now I never will be. I struggle to write about my father because I don't know if I like him, and this makes me feel like a bad person. I know that he is, and always has been, kind and polite. He isn't racist, he isn't sexist, he isn't homophobic, he's never had a drinking problem, he's never yet had problematic debts. He's never hit me, my sister, or my mother. He's never been verbally aggressive or rude. It's not normal to dislike someone because they didn't do anything special. But sometimes I do. This disapproval grew because when I was a teenager going through those oh-so-important things that teenagers go through, he wasn't there. Well, not emotionally. He was always present physically, which made this harder to ignore. He didn't talk. He didn't engage. He didn't ask questions about me. I found this unforgivable. I hated my father because he never took me aside and talked to me about girls. I hated my father because he never took me to the pub, didn't teach me how to shave, change tires, put up shelves, fix things. He never did any of the cliched things a dad is meant to do as his son turns into a man. He wasn't always closed off as a child, under 10. I remember many occasions when he played with me and my sister. I remember he used to take us for walks through local woodland and make up stories, always about wolves and wild dogs. When I was a small child, he did all the things a dad was supposed to do. Actually, that's unfair. He did more than was expected. He coached the under-11s cricket team. I was a reserve fielder for. He was a governor at the primary school my sister and I attended. When my sister got a paper round, she was too lazy to do sometimes. He did it instead, so she wouldn't lose the job. So yeah, he wasn't a bad father. He wasn't charming, he wasn't eloquent, he wasn't rich, but he comfortably achieved all the basic requirements of fatherhood, plus a little bit more. He was a good man. That's the nicest thing I can think to say about him. I never played a single game for the cricket team my father coached. He, however, played sport, hockey in the winter, cricket in the summer, every weekend until well into his 50s, at the same sports club as his brother and his brother's sons, which was the same club his father and his grandfather had played at too. This was not the club I trained at. My father never suggested I play there amongst the other Hadley men. My father decided I, with my glasses, bookishness, and poor hand-eye coordination, wasn't suitable for the clubhouse that men of my bloodline had been frequenting for generations. So I was taken instead, from the age of about 8, to a peaceful village club just outside the town. There's a part of me that wants to look at this and read abandonment, that my father saw my lack of sporting prowess and masculinity as embarrassing, that he did not want the guys up the club, as he used to say, to know that his son was different. However, I think the opposite's true. If my father wanted to abandon me for my lack of sporting aptitude, he would have left me at home, rather than take me to engage with his interests elsewhere. And if his plan was that I develop sufficiently to become good enough to be introduced to his friends, why, when he ran the coaching sessions, would he spend more time giving tips and advice to the boys that were good at cricket rather than fruitlessly focusing on me? There was no visible disappointment, no sense of shame. I suppose he just wanted to be around his son, and a shared interest in sport was the only way he knew for men to interact. Maybe he was being braver than I gave him credit for, aware that as a bespectacled geek, I didn't have the toughness for the laborers he played with. He went out of his comfort zone to find a middle-class club where we could play together. I have pleasant memories of prepubescent summers at that idyllic rural ground nestled in the side of a wide valley. I remember beautiful, wide skies, the vivid sheen of the yellow rapeseed fields surrounding the pitch. I remember sheltering against summer downpours in the clubhouse, illicit packets of crisps, and I remember being driven through the countryside and tunelessly singing along to old songs on the radio with my dad. I remember a lot about those summers, but I don't remember much cricket. When I was 11, I began to attend a grammar school, 7 miles away in a more affluent town. There, my accent, clothes, camping holidays, lack of worldliness, and my father's unskilled factory job made me a swift target for bullying. But the counterpoint to this aspect of school was my pleasant surprise upon discovering in teachers and the parents of my peers, male adults who had read books, who could speak about things I didn't understand, and who had been further from the West Midlands than Cornwall in the last 20 years. My father has been a daily reader of The Sun for as long as I can remember. I persuaded my mother to buy him The Times instead once when I was about 12, but it went unopened and unread. Even then, I still tried to cluelessly brag to my middle-class peers that my parents had bought a broadsheet. Events like this and the loud classroom jokes that followed my first grammar school friend visiting my home gradually made me feel nothing but scorn for where I came from. He was my first best friend at grammar school, and his father was a management consultant who sometimes lectured at a nearby university. And I both had younger siblings, and we bonded on induction day by singing together the theme tunes from CBBC shows aimed at 6 to 8-year-olds. Induction day happened before the end of primary school, and I remember being awed by that first day inside a middle-class school. I'd never been to London. I don't think I'd been to Birmingham, the nearest city, more than a handful of times. I'd seen very little of the world. There were 3 children in my new class who'd been to private school, like Hogwarts. They wore blazers and straw hats as part of their uniform. "It's not a straw hat, it's a boater," one of them told me. Loads of my new classmates were going to France, Italy, and Spain that summer, and almost all of them spoke in voices clipped and proper, like people on telly. There was only one other boy with an accent like mine. I felt I was sneaking into a different world. At the end of the day, when everyone's parents picked them up, I don't think I'd ever seen before so many cars that weren't dented or gushing black smoke in the same place. My father looked distinctly unglamorous in a fleece jumper and a scratched-up Metro, particularly when parked next to BMWs driven by proud men in suits. A year or two later, he told me my dad was stupid and made up a song about my mother being fat. He came to a sleepover at my house, and then the Monday after told everyone at school about the grubby wallpaper and the worn carpets and the stacks of tabloids my father used to stockpile before taking them to the local recycling point. I used to dread non-uniform days because I knew other people would laugh again at my tracksuit bottoms by George at Asda and my t-shirts from Tesco, my clunky trainers knockoffs of an uncool brand. The materialism was relentless. And I felt no loyalty. I felt no love. I was 12, then 13, then 14, then 15. I listened to the people whose parents had degrees and detached houses, crammed bookshelves, DVD players, theater trips, spare bedrooms, art. I distanced myself from my family because they were poor and lacked culture, and I was taught this had to be despised. I just did an internet search for my father. I tried where he lives and the company he worked at for 25 years, but I couldn't find a mention of him anywhere except on 192.com. I found another man with the same name who lives about 10 miles away from him, a man who continues my father's abandoned hobbies of cricket and jogging. This felt odd, almost like his identity had been usurped. Maybe the Hadley from Hales Owen would prove to be a better father to me. Maybe I could call him up and we'd talk about my worries, my sister's laziness, my terrible relationship, my mother's health, my lack of a career, my drinking, my maternal grandmother's cancer, about how I'm just struggling to fucking adapt, Dad, to adult life. But Hadley from Hales Owen doesn't want to hear about my problems. And Hadley from the real Hadley has never wanted to either. You could argue that my father came from a different culture to me. That by choosing to attend a grammar school, I threw away my rights to legitimate expectations of camaraderie with a sports-loving, unskilled labourer without any O-levels. But this isn't true. Part of my father's limited education happened at private school. His family regularly holidayed abroad when he was a child, and his younger brother went to university and still has about 10 years left of a career that has seen him occupy high-level administrative positions at several of the huge car factories in the Midlands. My uncle, who I barely know, subscribes to The Guardian, has read B.S. Johnson, and travels widely. He seems to be happy and well-informed. He likes sport too, so he and my father have always got on. This is one of the ways I used to justify my feelings towards my father. He had opportunities growing up that I never did, and he squandered them. The private education he had, his parents couldn't really afford. His mother was mayor of the town in the 1960s, my grandfather an estate agent. They spent a lot of money, leaving nothing for later. My grandmother died in a cramped council flat when I was about 5, though her husband is now in his 90s, alive and active. He's regularly burgled the block of flats he lives in, surrounded by burnt-out cars, syringes, empty K cider cans, roaches, and broken glass. But my grandfather is fine, despite all that, and he recently installed the internet. By contrast, my mother bought my father a tablet computer for his 60th birthday, which he broke within a week and hid out of shame. He found it confusing. My father's mother died of Parkinson's disease too. There's no scientific guarantee that it's hereditary, but there is already, in my family, evidence to suggest that it is. I'm not happy to accept a slow decline and a painful death. I'm pro-euthanasia and often behave impulsively because I'm certain that if I do not die through misadventure or suicide by the time I'm 50, I will follow in my father and my grandmother's horrible shuffling footsteps. Secretly, I'm scared. I'm really fucking scared. And I feel like I can never have children in case I pass it on to them, or in case my personality is destroyed before they love me. My father was diagnosed definitively during my second year of university. It was explained to me that a lack of emotional engagement is a very early symptom of the disease. So the blank-faced man I grew to hate as a teenager was not a man who refused to engage. He was a man who, due to a degenerative medical physical condition, could not. The first person I tried to discuss this with was my friend, someone who I still see occasionally, but really our relationship peaked in the minutes before this exchange. We were sat next to a roaring summer bonfire at an end of term, though for him pre-graduation, after party. I've just found out my dad's got Parkinson's, I said. Well, my girlfriend's just broken up with me because I'm not a suitable partner for a graduate, he said, doing air quotes with his fingers like everyone did that decade. I've hated this man for years, and the reasons can all be explained by illness, I said. I get it, he said. I know I like the pub and my football, but I'm a grafter too, yeah? I don't like him, but I don't want to watch him die. Sure, said newly single. I'm going to go get stoned. As he walked away, someone ripped off a fence panel and threw it on the fire. Everyone's got problems, but I wanted to talk about mine. The years of disgust suddenly felt shameful. It felt so unfair and so unreasonable to feel that way about an ill man. I cried and railed and drank and smoked and partied too much for a few weeks, but then I decided there was something I was ignoring. My father had been emotionally unavailable during the important teenage parts of my youth. This is a thing that happened. My father was not there for things I saw other people, male and female, do with their fathers, and this is something I did miss out on. But thinking this makes me feel like a prick. My father never beat me, didn't run away, didn't fuck my girlfriends, didn't vomit on my bed, didn't steal my books to sell for crack, didn't go bankrupt, didn't throw me out when I talked about kissing boys. He didn't do anything bad. And he kept me fed, watered, and with a roof over my head. I had my own room, a bicycle, an N64. It wasn't poverty. So why did I care so much that he wasn't rich? I often used to form weird obsessions with the successful men I met. In sixth form, I found myself thinking about a friend's entrepreneur father all the time. His name was and he had an Aston Martin like James Bond. He smoked cigars and stayed in hotels and knew how to scuba dive and was on his second marriage. He wore beautiful shoes and sharp suits and said things like, "The most important thing in a man's life is a good wallet," as he poured champagne into a crystal glass. He was a self-described school dropout who night schooled his way from O-levels through to an MBA and was the richest person I'd ever met. It was only because of him that I realized something else my father was lacking. There was nothing cool about him, nothing fashionable. And he wasn't the only man cooler than my father I became fascinated by. I still watch with filial pride my favorite teacher's career development over Facebook. He was a giant Chicagoan jazz singer with an encyclopedic knowledge of music, poetry, prose, and art. God, I wanted him to like me. But he had conspicuously less time for me the harder I tried to fit in with the other pupils. I wish I'd paid attention to that. Since school, I've continued to seek masculine approval from bosses and lecturers and other people's fathers because I never knew it as a thing you could get at home. My maternal grandfather, who I respect, has started having heart trouble recently. I see him only a few times a year, but I know that when he dies, my non-butch tears will turn heads at his funeral. And if, as is likely to happen given his age and the time since my father's diagnosis, the two men died at a similar time, I know that my visible grief will be heartily disapproved of up in the repressed West Midlands. I've already cried many tears for my ill father, as well as for my imaginary perfect father I've never had and now never will, but there are still more tears to come. A good father-in-law is all I can hope for, but I'm getting older, and so are the fathers of the women I could marry. The father of the woman I live with doesn't like me. My girlfriend tells me he doesn't approve of my lack of ambition, by which he means my lack of interest in making money. He, the man of an older generation I see most frequently, and probably deep down most want to impress, doesn't like me for the exact same reasons I don't like my own father. My father and I look alike. I find this harder to ignore. I've put on weight recently, just a little bit, but enough to make me look both older and less handsome. I'm more like my father. Our faces are the same shape. No, that's not true. My face is the same shape as I remember his face, because when I see him now, he looks like an old man. 10 years ago, 5 maybe, he looked young for his age. But as his body has destroyed itself from within, he's developed a stoop, his walk has become a shuffle, his hands have begun to shake so much, I stare at them when I'm with him and I want to scream, "Stop fucking shaking!" But even I have the tact to keep that inside. His hair has grayed and fallen out. I remember him carrying a comb around when I was a child, always keeping his hair fixed. I suppose he used to be handsome. Well, I have to convince myself of that if I want to feel comfortable leaving the house, because when I look in a mirror, I see his slack eyes staring back. It's why I've always kept my hair long, not because I look better, certainly not because I look more mature, but so I look less like him. There's only one photograph of him in my possession. I tried to find a digital copy to paste in here, but it's not on this computer and I've never put it on the internet. I must have last seen it in a physical form last Christmas while looking through boxes of teenage possessions. In that photograph, he looks great. Tan, strong, healthy. He always had good teeth. I don't know what they look like now. The photograph I'm thinking of was taken on a disposable camera just before a party I went to at the beginning of sixth form. It would be the first night I drank alcohol, the first time anyone ever touched my penis, the first time I smoked a cigarette, and the first time I fell asleep with another person in my arms. It was at a farm that belonged to the family of 2 sisters I went to school with. There was a field of tents, a makeshift stage in a barn, live music, a lake, a botched attempt at cunnilingus in a hedgerow, a fire, a barbecue, parents laid back about the idea of 100 teenagers sleeping and pissing and vomiting next to their house, dogs, cats, chickens, and visible as the sun rose, their voices echoing across the dew-licked fields, cows. It's a very long sentence. This was the point in my life when key changes were coming and the adult I became was being born. And as much as I teen angstly hated my parents and was getting ready to go to the first wild party of my life, there was still a part of me that wished to include an image of my father amongst the visual material evidence of that party. Maybe I wasn't so bad. A few weeks ago, I went with my father to a professional football match. I'd never been to one before, not even to my father's hallowed Villa Park. He was meant to be going with his brother who cancelled. I offered myself as a replacement to allow my father to have a father-son experience like a normal fucking bloke should have already had by his age. It was strange. And it was a facade. When men go together to football, I imagine they talk. I imagine they discuss players and opposition and tactics. I imagine they banter, chat about women, politics, business, whatever. But my father and I had nothing. He is quiet now. He says very little. I knew nothing about the game and felt no interest in the performance of either team, but I sat there and enjoyed the spectacle. We parked in an industrial estate to save money and walked from the car. We crossed over a dual carriageway, and as we began to walk down a residential street that my father said was a shortcut, he suddenly shouted to a man he knew, "Rocky." For a moment, they discussed the forthcoming match energetically with excitement and insight. "This your lad?" Rocky asked, and my father said a monosyllabic "yeah" before the conversation petered out. I shook Rocky's hand and he jogged off to catch up with his friends. "He's a good bloke," my father said, pointing in the direction he'd gone. He wasn't much older than me. Inside the stadium, staring at the rectangle of green, I began to understand the mentality of the crowd. I felt lifted and buoyed and shaken by the vast amounts of emotion being expelled within those walls. I heard my father say names and words under his breath. I didn't understand. At one point, I got swept up in the excitement and stood to watch a player almost score a goal. When I looked across at my father, stood beside me. He smiled. I enjoyed, too, the booming echo the stadium made whenever the ball was kicked particularly hard, and I was amused by the low quality of the entertainment during halftime and the cheap local adverts scrolling on the big screen. Also, too, I felt good giving my father the opportunity to enjoy an archetypal male activity, but it felt false. He hadn't taken his son to his first football match. I'd taken him. I'd driven. I'd helped him cross the roads. I'd tried to keep conversation going. I'd tried to make sure he was excited and enjoying himself. Even though I wasn't somewhere I'd been before, and even though he insisted on paying for everything, I felt responsible. I felt stressed watching him count coins out of a plastic bag as his chubby, shaking fingers struggled to grip the metal discs. I felt like a carer. I felt in charge, but I didn't feel comfortable grabbing the bag from his hands and counting out the money. My father's always kept his change in plastic money bags. I've many memories of his thick digits scraping 20-pence pieces out of them in fish and chip shops, gambling shops, and petrol stations across the UK. My friend's father once told me that having a nice wallet was a masculine essential. And back then, seeing my own father extract torn plastic bags from the pocket of a dirty high-vis coat was enough to make me blush. But the meaning of the lack of wallet is gone. Now it is the loss of dexterity that has meaning. The way his palm cannot keep still to hold the bag steady, the way he has to screw up his eyes like a toddler to control his fingers. The most important thing in my father's life isn't the lack of a good wallet and the lack of money to put in it. It is the disease that has, bit by bit, begun to end his life. At the football, I wasn't overwhelmed by the crowds. I wasn't awed by the game. It wasn't the important moment in my life or his that I thought it should have been. And I didn't know how he felt because though I asked him, he wouldn't say. He never says. And now, when I know that I should be cherishing every moment because he can't have more than 5 years left, tops, I can't be bothered. I don't feel enough. I don't feel sad because he's dying, nor do I feel sad that the only traditional father-son activity we ever shared as adults was something I initiated. Would it be worth repeating? Not really, as to do this regularly would be inconvenient. We live 100 miles apart. Gestures like this don't mean enough to make them worth the time and expense. But what retains disproportionate meaning is that idea of the imaginary father I never had. And I know that none of the ideals are perfect. I know my friends with successful fathers have weighty expectations pushed on them. I know my friends whose dads are actively trying to be cool wish they'd grow up a bit. I know my friends who never knew their dad wish he'd be more present. I know my friends whose dads died unexpectedly wish they'd had the opportunity for a prolonged goodbye. And that's just it. My relationship with my father feels like little more than a prolonged goodbye. He's not going to get better, and he's not going to become articulate and charming and affluent either. He's nice, and he didn't run away. The general consensus seems to be that this is what makes someone a good father. But why couldn't he have been nice and exciting? I know I'm a bad person for not being able to love my father, but every time I see him, there's more he cannot do. He's been forced into early retirement. I no longer feel comfortable being driven by him and find it hard to believe he will be legally allowed to drive for much longer. He cannot keep himself fit. He cannot learn anything new. I look at his life and see nothing to be proud of, nothing to define him in any way at all. I see this despite knowing that the achievements of my school friends' fathers are equally as transient. They will leave no more significant an imprint on the world. In 100 years' time, we will all be forgotten. My father's best quality is that he is kind. He's never knowingly hurt anyone, destroyed anything, or committed any act in front of me that has any kind of selfish motivation. But it is from this that my apathy stems. He is selfless to the point where he's failed to form set ideas of what and who he is. He does not display desire. He's never displayed ambition. He's failed to impress me because he's never achieved anything, and he's never achieved anything because he never tried to. My apathy towards him may be rooted in materialism, but it's also connected to the fact that his existence, his idea of self, is so minor in his life. I felt fatherless as a teenager because I had a dad I couldn't debate with, I couldn't learn from, I couldn't hang out with. And this empty father has slid with characteristic lack of effort from uninspiring middle age to dying old man. Though I'm not yet literally fatherless, maybe given my lack of empathy, it's fair to call me a bastard. The real betrayal was mine, growing to despise a peaceful, unimposing father. I know he did nothing wrong by failing to be a proper, rich grammar school daddy. I wish I hadn't listened to the schoolroom jeers. I wish I hadn't learnt contempt. But there isn't time to make amends. And if there were, I don't think I'd bother. I'm letting him down, but he let me down first. So what if it was Parkinson's fault? I did live through years with an emotionally absent father. So he's probably going to die with an emotionally absent son. Nobody wins, and both of us lose. Coda. It's now a few years on from when I collected the above thoughts. Back then, I wanted my father to die so I could forget about the way I felt. My father is not yet dead. And for a couple of years after that point, medication and retirement had an unexpectedly beneficial effect on him. Psychologically, though not physically, my father was for about 18 months healthier than he had been for years. During the winter of 2014, I stood up to an unpleasant, physically intimidating man who aggressively threatened my sister. By doing so, I earned the respect of my father in a traditional masculine way. My dad took me to a pub and we shared a couple of pints, played pool, and he told me about his life, opening up emotionally in a way I'd previously thought impossible. My father and I became friends. We went on holiday together 3 times, just the two of us. I feel sorry for myself for how pessimistically I used to feel about him. He started getting worse again recently, but the fact that he came back for a bit felt significant. My father's hands shake, but he smiles all the time, just like he did when I was a child, just like he did when I loved him before. Coda 2. Time flows on, and my father's ancient father dies, and then my father rapidly declines. He's still alive, and I'm typing these last few sentences in the same room as him. My father gets worse and worse and worse, and I'm conscious that this may be the last time I ever see him. I'm moving far away in a few days, much further from the West Midlands than London, and I won't be back for a while, maybe never. It was easier waiting for him to die before he had that year and a half of brief improvement. We went on holiday together 3 times. We went to 3 football matches. We could do neither now. It's nice we had that, but I now have a reality to mourn rather than just a fantasy. When I was a younger man, I used to think the problem with my father was that he was never what I wanted. But as a wiser, bold adult, I realized that the problem was more serious than that. He was never what I needed. I'm a weird, depressive, manic, anxious mess of a person. And what it's taken me for me to become a functioning adult is a good therapist and lots of medication. What could my father have done differently so that I could have reached this point a decade ago? I know the answer. I needed him to teach me to feel comfortable admitting I had a problem, to feel like it was okay to ask for help. This is where he failed. I had to learn to help myself, which my father has never done. He withers now because he skips his physiotherapy and doesn't do his exercises at home. He withers now because he avoids the Parkinson's social groups. He withers now because he does nothing to help himself. My father and I were lucky to have some good times, even if neither of us were at our best when it happened. It remains true that nobody wins, but maybe now it is only him that loses. Oh, and I found the photograph I mentioned earlier. He was very good looking. Maybe that is why he never tried. This was written mostly in 2014, spring 2014, with the first coda autumn 2016, and then the last section on January the 7th, 2019. Thank you. Oh, it's wobbling. Ugh. Bye. He was a giant Chicagoan. How do you pronounce that? Someone from Chicago. Chicagoan? Chicagan.